lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm doing my August reading wrap up, which will also double as my N.E.W.T.S magical readathon reading wrap up. So in the month of August I read 13 books, which does mean I did manage to complete all the challenges I needed to complete my curse breaker qualification for the N.E.W.T.S magical readathon. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to focus first of all on the books I read for my qualifications for that particular career that I was working on, and then I'll cover any of the extra ones that I picked up. So the first book that I read was for my A in arithmetic, and this was Windwalker by N.E.W.T.S. Windwalker I gave 8 out of 10. N.E.W.T.S is the author of Seasons of the Witch, which is one of my all-time favourite books, and this was the first time I'd read something from her other than that book. I found stylistically it was very similar to Seasons of the Witch, but there were a few features of the story in particular that just didn't really resonate with me. This was kind of like a soulmates, both with kind of tortured pasts that meet and come together, and it's kind of about fate and the idea of controlling your destiny or your destiny controlling you. There were some really nice atmospheric touches from the description. I think N.E.W.T.S is very... Sorry, there's a motorbike. I think N.E.W.T.'s strongest feature is definitely her description. I think she does that very, very well. I don't really like her characters a lot of the time. I think that they can be a little bit kind of pastiche of the various tropes that she's going for. I also felt like with this book there was a very unnecessary stalker plotline that really detracted from the main storyline for me, and I felt like if we could have got rid of that, which was adding a lot of suspense that it didn't need, actually there would have been more room to explore the relationships between the two main characters, which I was definitely significantly more interested in. A little fun bonus of this particular book was it featured a lot of information about scuba diving and a lot of technical information, and I always really enjoy it when a fiction book goes into detail about something that I know nothing about. So I got to learn a lot about the wonderful world of scuba diving, which was fascinating. So that gave it like a little extra bonus for me. For my O in arithmetic, I read Severance by Ling Ma, I think is the author. I gave this a 5 out of 10, and I actually talked about it recently in my most recent video, which was kind of comparing Goodreads reviews, positive and negative, for books that I have a mixed opinion on. The book is essentially a kind of post-apocalyptic dystopian fiction where the world has been infected by this zombie virus that makes you kind of repeat the same tasks over and over again at the expense of your own health until you kind of waste away. The disease seems to be linked to nostalgia in some way, and it seems to be more likely to happen if you're around your like almost like birthplace or places that have very strong memories for you. So the story is interweaving between the like first discovery of this disease and kind of the initial outbreak, and then the kind of time onwards where our main character finds herself with a group of survivalists, and they're desperately trying to kind of, you know, keep everything together in this post-apocalyptic future. Basically, I really like dystopian fictions, post-apocalyptic fiction, as is kind of well documented on this channel. So the features of it that are fairly classic of dystopian fiction I clearly enjoyed, because that's something I really do enjoy. I like the survivalist elements, I love the discussion of like what are we going to miss, all that kind of thing. I really didn't get along with the kind of quirk or gimmick of this particular book, which was this idea of like repeating activities, and it was supposed to be a bit of like a social commentary on the idea of us being slaves already to this, and like can you even tell the difference between an infected and non-infected, because we all just go about our lives repeating the same mundane tasks, and oh god, what's the point of it all? And frankly, that's the kind of navel-gazing nonsense that I really don't enjoy in books, and think has been done much better in other books, and this really just did not strike a chord with me. So this was what led to my mixed feelings about it. Generally, I would not recommend this book. I personally think if you're going to go for something like this, just read Station 11, man. It's better. It's one of the best in its genre. Just stick with the greats. Then I read The Thief of Time by John Boyne. I read this for my O in arithmetic, and boy, I hated this book. This is another one where realistically there is an alternative that you should read instead, and that is How to Stop Time by Matt Haig. Both of them feature a gentleman who no longer really ages, and instead kind of travels through time just for the sheer point of existing, and gets a kind of 300-400 year old mark, and it is about their story through time. However, John Boyne's book, unlike Matt Haig's, had absolutely no ramifications or like consequences to this kind of weird feature and bug of this person. There was no need to hide it from society. There was no discussion of like nobody freaked out about it. It was basically just 400 pages like it was just a ton of pages of like white guy does a bunch of cool shit throughout history and nobody and like no consequences happened to him whatsoever. There were a series of very shallow generic female characters that dotted like popped up throughout his life that were generic girlfriends and wives, all of which who met untimely ends or were divorced because they were a pain in the arse. Nothing happened, nothing interesting occurred, even though this like male character again had this phenomenal ability to be at every major point in history over the past 400 years that was interesting or relevant, or managed to meet all the interesting people and had connections with and like such high society, but there were absolutely again no ramifications for people noticing that this guy just doesn't age. He's talking about building opera houses in Italy 200 years ago. No one's locking him up for being a crazy dude. Like, it was just so removed from the world, and I hated so much of it. The only mildly redeeming points were some of the interesting historical facts that you bump into along the way, but mildly redeeming. Again, read Matt Haig's How to Stop Time. Way more interesting, fascinating discussion about the concept. John Boyne can suck it. Then I needed an O in Ancient Runes, and this is where I start to cross over with some of my books that I read for Thrillerathon. I only read 2. I will flag them in this video when they come up. The first one I read was Agatha Christie's Cards on the Table. I really enjoyed this. This is a Hercule Poirot book. I think it's number 15 in the series, but you don't need to read them in order. This is very much a psychological mystery. There are 4 main suspects. Any one of them could have done it. Any one of them could have added the motive, but it comes down to psychologically who do you think was in the right like situation where it was them. I had a good time. It was good fun. This was a recommendation from Books Like Woe, Mara's channel, and she knows her stuff when it comes to like golden age of crime. This is my second Agatha Christie. I really enjoy her writing style, and it was really interesting as like a Thrillerathon experience because I've kind of finally narrowed down what I enjoy about crime and thriller, and it definitely does sit in that golden age of crime genre and sort of subset, because they don't go for the like cheap thrills, almost like jump scare tactics that thrillers quite often have, that like trying to gross the reader out with as much like gory twists as you can. It's just like really classic detectives. But because of that, I actually didn't have the most successful Thrillerathon in the world, because actually when you narrow it down, I read like 2. I read this one and then a Sherlock Holmes, and then was like, I don't want to read another detective book. Like, done 2 back to back. I really need a breather or something completely different. But now I've used Thrillerathon to like really hone in on what I enjoy in the thriller genre. I'm going to feel far more comfortable with like scattering them in my standard reading, and that's going to be really good fun, because it is something which I do enjoy, and now I've pinned down what I really enjoy about them. Definitely going to be interested in trying out more Agatha Christie's. Have realised that both ones I've done are Poirot, so I'd really like to try Miss Marple. I might even attempt to read the entire collection slowly over a long period of time with absolutely no deadline on that, but cracking read. Then is my other one that I read in Thrillerathon, which is A Study in Scarlet by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is the first in the Sherlock Holmes series. My rabbits did take a bit of a bite out of it. This is approved by my rabbit toaster. She thinks it's very tasty. I really enjoyed this. This is the first full-length Sherlock Holmes I've read. I also read a collection of short stories this month, which I'll talk about later. This is a bit strange because halfway through we get a bit of a weird segue into Mormonism, but it does bring itself back around. But actually, I didn't really mind that segue, because I think Arthur Conan Doyle's writing style is so rich and gorgeous and flowing, and just has such a lovely like rhythm and beat to it, that basically I was kind of on board for wherever we went, even if I wasn't 100% certain why we were going that direction. Like the random segue into Mormonism, I had utter faith that he was going to pull it back around and it was going to make sense. But even if it didn't, I was kind of content learning about Mormonism, because when the sentences are that nice, you don't mind reading them. It was really fascinating as well to see the interaction between Watson and Sherlock, because this is the first time that they meet, and that was really fun. And it was lovely to see that, like, I feel like the Sherlock Holmes character in pop culture has become almost a parody of himself, with the kind of quirky sociopathic genius character that he now is. And it was really lovely to see the original, because he's far less zany and quirky and far more down to earth. And honestly, I find Sherlock in most movies and TV series just irritating and unbearable, whereas in this one I really enjoyed him, because the traits of his that I find very frustrating were toned down to like a real person's level, rather than the like genius character that he now has become like an archetype of. I would heavily recommend this book and any Arthur Conan Doyle, so anybody who even vaguely likes crime, so good. Then we have my first kind of departure from the original TBR. I was going to read a Raymond Chandler before the longest book that's been on my TBR, but instead I picked up a non-fiction which I was really excited about, which has been on my TBR since October last year, is in my want to read list, but I finally actually saw it in a bookstore and got a hold of it, and that is Grunt by Mary Roach. I blitzed this in a day. I had such a good time reading it, and it was really timely. This was where I really, after reading the Agatha Christie and the Arthur Conan Doyle, I didn't want to read a Raymond Chandler. I really didn't, which was a shame because I've been meaning to get around to another Raymond Chandler for a while, but I didn't want to read another detective story or PI or whatever you want to call it, and I was so in the mood for some non-fiction. So this was perfect timing. Grunt is basically looking at the science behind war, but specifically the science behind the kind of maintenance of war rather than like the new advances in technologies to do with weapons. So when we talk about winning war, it's about, you know, how do you keep your soldiers not tired, how do you deal with things like basically illness on the battlefront and things like that, rather than like what are the coolest advances in weapons and how many new exciting ways do we have to kill people. So some of the topics in this include things like diarrhea and the issues that creates on the front. Sharks, are they genuinely an issue when boats sink? Submarines, when they go wrong, how do you get out? What else was there? Sleep deprivation, that was an interesting one. It talked about using maggots as a way of cleaning wounds. There was a really cool chapter discussing basically the reconstruction of genital injuries, specifically focused on the penis. Absolutely fascinating. Very, very interesting to see also the US. It was mainly focused on the US government and US Army because of the author's connections, but it was interesting to see that intersection of like the US's desire to fund military, which it's always very keen on, but its lack of desire to fund anything to do with sex education, and the like way that collided. Mary Roach's style is very easy and flowing and quite comedic, which is excellent, but she does that thing which I don't like in non-fiction where the topics kind of meander from one to the other, using it as a way of like segueing between them, whereas personally I prefer slightly harsher lines to be drawn between the topics because I'm happy for us to do a bit more of a jolt. We're done with this one and we're moving on to that one, whereas I know a lot of authors try and blend them in so that it almost mimics fiction a bit more, but I don't personally like that style. I don't think that got in the way of the enjoyment of this. I still gave this, I think, like an 8 or 9 out of 10. I would be really inclined to read more of her stuff. Her most famous one is Stiff, which is about human cadavers, which is the one that a lot of people know, but I would really recommend this. I thought it was fascinating. So those were all the things I needed for my Ancient Runes, and now we're going to talk about my Defence Against the Dark Arts qualification. The first one for that was my A in Defence Against the Dark Arts, and I read The Possessions by Sarah Flannery Murphy, I think. I've lost my copy of this. I read this on holiday. I'm sure I packed it and brought it back with me. It's somewhere in my house. This is what happens with books. We just lose them. It's fine. It'll turn up tomorrow when I'm cleaning. The Possessions was creepy and spooky in a very fun way. It basically kind of told a speculative fiction future where we have the ability to kind of embody the dead. Basically people can take a pill, and in doing so they can call back somebody who's been recently deceased, and then that person's like spirit genuinely inhabits them, and it's kind of a service that you can do to be able to continue a relationship with somebody who has died in whatever way that means to you. And then with this kind of a storyline, it became an interesting discussion about personal identity and the idea of like who do you embody and who are you at your heart, and also like what do you give away in that. And the actual kind of plot is basically a gentleman comes to this service provider to get in contact with his dead wife, and there's fears about whether he has actually killed her or not, but then also the woman who's like letting his dead wife inhabit her body starts falling for the husband, and then you get a whole kind of range of interesting conflicting emotions there. There were a few twists that I didn't personally enjoy. I thought they went for some of the shock value rather than actually being something that kind of improved the storyline. But generally I found this one really like evocative and emotive, and just a fascinating concept executed, you know, pretty well, like well enough that I was happy to keep reading it. Again, I blitzed this one in about a day and a half, and just really enjoyed it. It's a book I've not heard anybody talk about, so I'd really recommend it if you like creepy, weird, almost like a domestic thriller, but with this kind of like funky speculative fiction, almost like Exorcist style like veneer over the top. Very cool, very weird book, really good fun. Then is my E, Defense Against the Dark Arts, and I was supposed to read The Book of Fires, but instead I'm going to use my wild card, which was the Spellslinger, which was the group book. So this one basically you could use in place of any other book that you wanted to, and this was really helpful. So I was not in the mood for historical fiction, so I used it as my placeholder. It was actually the first book that I finished out the entire month. So this is by Sebastian de Castel, and this is a YA fantasy book, or like urban fantasy, I guess. And it's basically, it was kind of like this kid who is not very good at the magic in the world that he's in, and he's quite concerned about it, and it looks like he's going to basically be like disowned by his parents because he's crap at the magic system, and his sister's amazing, and it kind of becomes an ongoing story about that. And he meets this quite fun, quirky stranger who then kind of creates shenanigans, and then it uncovers a big elaborate plot. It's all very exciting. It's the first one in the series, and I had a good time. Like, you know, I'm never the biggest fan of YA because I think it has its place and time in my reading, but it's not something that I personally favour. But I had a really good time. The magic system was quite cool and interesting. I generally enjoyed most of the characters and what was happening there. It's your classic standard fantasy where you kind of, if you stop and think about the plot too hard, it all starts to fall apart. But you know, we're on a roller coaster, we're having fun, there's highs, there's lows, everything's going really well. I potentially will continue with this series. I'm thinking about buying book 2, and it'll be one of these like light, fluffy, easy to read kind of things that sits on your shelf for a while and then has its moment in the sun when you really need it. So I was really pleased that it was the group book, because it's definitely something I wouldn't have picked up by myself, but it was absolutely perfect as like my intro into my holiday reading as well. It was a really good way to kind of chill out and really embrace the holiday spirit. So fantastic, good fun, 7 out of 10, liking it. And the last book to talk about for my collection of qualifications for my Cursebreaker qualification, but then I do have some more books after that, so don't go anywhere. For charms, I read The Doll Factory by Elizabeth McNeil. This is a historical fiction set in Victorian, I think, basically around the time of the pre-Raphaelites, whatever that was. It's very much focused on art, and it was absolutely fascinating. I love the pre-Raphaelites, I love modern art, and they are often considered kind of the hallmark very beginnings of what we would consider to be modern art today. They were the ones who were really first playing around with a lot of the form that was happening there. It was quite fascinating to see some kind of characters from history that I do know a bit about to then be represented in a fiction book, and it was really interesting seeing the intersection of the two. The storyline for this one is very much, it's about a young woman who desperately wants to be an artist, and she has an opportunity to model for a fictional pre-Raphaelite character who's been added onto the gang, and she says yes in return for painting lessons. But mixed in with this as well is a kind of thriller aspect, because she's basically being stalked by a fairly creepy dude who's really into taxidermy, and then obviously there's a big climax there at the end. Unfortunately, reading Windwalker earlier on in the month, and the Possessions had a bit of a kind of stalkery undertone to it as well. It meant by the time I got around to The Doll Factory, I really wasn't in the mood to read yet more fiction about idolising women from afar in a creepy, possessive way, which was a real shame, because I think The Doll Factory did that particular style of fiction significantly better than what Windwalker or The Possessions did. But because I read this one after them, I was a bit sick of it by that point. I think if I could like go back in time and change my reading order, this would have much higher praise than what I currently have for it. Which is, you know, an interesting discussion about ratings in general, especially like thinking about my kind of discussion earlier about being done with detective novels and not wanting to read a Raymond Chandler because of it. And I do think my ratings are heavily influenced by like what I've read around the book as well. And I may do a whole separate video talking about this, but I don't think my thoughts are coherent enough to make that worth watching yet. So when they are, I'll finally do it. Good fun, very pretty, yet rich writing style, really lovely historical details. It is really a thriller at its heart. It's got a lot of information about art and modern art, so if you do enjoy that side of things and art history in general, you probably will really enjoy it. And I had, again, a really good time reading it. It's been generally a very, very positive reading month. Okay, so that was everything I needed for my Cursebreaker qualification, but I have read, I think, 4 more books of just like a bunch of extras. I didn't quite go as far as to get the like 16 or 17 that I wanted this month. I think I've got 13, but I did pretty well. I picked up my A in Herbology for an audiobook, and that was The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I freaking loved this. I had the audiobook that was narrated by Maggie Gyllenhaal. I would hugely recommend that one. Just the narrative style and her voice just suited perfectly for the kind of plot and the subject matter. It's basically a young woman's descent into madness and suicidal thoughts, and it documents her time in a mental hospital, but also pre that. And I think it's set in the 1920s, and it's all just lots of stuff going on. It's all really just gorgeous and fun and exciting and interesting, and I loved it. It was like, it captured for me that idea of like the ennui of the human existence in a way that Severance was trying to do but couldn't get a hold of, whereas I really felt it with the bell jar. Like, I was so invested even though not much was really happening, and we were just kind of descending into madness basically, but like I was there with her. I was on that descent and I was so happy to go with her. It was just beautiful and lyrical, and I can totally see why it's a modern classic, and I would really recommend it to anybody. It's amazing. Then for divination, for the first one, for A with a white cover, I listened to the audiobook of Mem by Bethany Clark. I think it's just going to be here. This is a novella, and this again was absolutely incredible, and again I would really recommend the audiobook. This is about a world where you can remove memories of particular incidences in your life, but they take a physical form, and they literally are like a corporeal, you can touch them, human representation of that moment in time for you, and they are trapped in that moment to relive it until they basically kind of just perish like a year later, and then that memory is gone from your head and you don't have to deal with it anymore. But the story is focused around a Mem who isn't just reiterating the same moment in time, and instead is her own fully formed individual person, and it's about discussions about personhood and what makes a memory and what makes a person, and when you remove things from people, what kind of damage does that do, and at what point do you become a full person rather than just like a human being. And yeah, it was amazing and incredible. And some of the criticism for this book is like, not a crazy amount happens, and that's essentially because it's almost not even really like a full story. It is very much like a thought experiment idea that they're playing around with, kind of expanding it out but not far enough to make it a full novel. And I was actually really pleased that they didn't expand it out, because I think it gave the author more room to not worry too much about the plot and just play around with the concepts and kind of have these little vignettes of other characters and other instances that were exploring different ideas within that. Having said that, if Bethany wants to write more of this world, I would so read it. I absolutely loved it. But this really ticks boxes for me, linking all the way back to like my undergraduate degree and talking about personhood and personal identity and like the continuation of the self, which I've talked about before, and I might do an entire video on books that are dedicated to that as a concept, because I think it's just so fascinating and so cool. Would hugely recommend that book. It's amazing. It's also very short, so if you're like, the audiobook was only about 5 hours long, and I think the book is like about 100 pages, so it's not going to take you a very long time, but you're going to have a good time whilst doing it. Then I have the other Sherlock Holmes that I read, which is The 5 Orange Pips and Other Cases. It's a collection of short stories, and this was for my E in divination. This was supposed to be for Thrillerathon, and I did start it in Thrillerathon, but I literally just finished it today. I really enjoyed this for pretty much the same reasons as I enjoyed the original Sherlock Holmes book that I was talking to you about just a second ago. However, I really struggle with short story collections because I don't personally like reading short stories. So for me, this one suffered because of that, and I would have preferred all of them to be a bit more expanded out. The reason I don't like reading short stories is because I don't like reading a book like 2 different stories back to back. I like to have a breather in between, because whilst I can have multiple books on the go, I can't go straight from one book to the next book without having something in the middle. And when you're reading a short story collection, it means that you have these enforced breaks, because I can't jump from one to the other. It feels unnatural and weird. So I'm kind of creating weird scenarios where I'll read, get to the end of a short story, and then be like, okay, I'll play on my phone for 5 minutes, or I'll go make a cup of tea. Like, I'm kind of having to break up the reading experience, which stops me from fully getting immersed in the actual act of reading, which is something that I enjoy independent to what I am reading, if that makes sense. So I just find reading short stories collections harder work than reading like a full novel or novella or whatever. With all of that, you know, put aside. Fantastic collection, great fun, the best short story collection I've read so far. Definitely going to read all the other ones in the Sherlock Holmes series. I love these characters. I love Arthur Conan Doyle's writing style. I have no complaints there whatsoever. So many of them were so inventive and interesting and fun and quirky, and I predicted a few of them. I got the endings of some. I'm a smart Sherlock Holmes. I'm not actually, he's a genius. And then the last book that I actually finished in the month of August was, it was going to be for a paperback for my O in Charms, but I've not done the E in Charms. So instead this is going to be for my A in History of Magic, as it's a fantasy, so it counts as that one as well. And that is The Voyage of the Basilisk by Marie Brennan. This is book 3 in the Memoirs of the Lady Trent series, and oh my god, I loved it, but are we really surprised? Because I freaking love that series, and all of the books have been 5 stars. Like, so happy, so content to be back in this world with these characters. So nice to see Lady Trent as like a fully grown woman now. She's got her child. She's really like embracing her status as like a legitimate scientist, coming up with theories. There were way more dragons in this one than book 2, which was a lot more about politics, so we were very happy for that. Some of the side characters, like, oh my god, I had such a crush on one of them. He was so good. We got some really cool things to do with like sea serpents, but then there were some fire ones. So much of this book was just a discussion of the taxonomy of dragons, which, like, my favourite thing about this series is just how much dedication to the science of dragonology that Marie Brennan has created. Like, world building to a freaking T. Like, this is just the holy grail of commitment to your bit, like Tolkien level detail, and I freaking love it. And this is something that some people aren't necessarily going to enjoy, but for me it's amazing. It literally is a natural history of dragons. It's incredible, and I'm definitely going to read book 4 fairly soon, and then I'll be really sad because I'll only have book 5 left, and then the series will be over, and what will I do with my life? So those are all the books that I finished. I did actually DNF a book, and I've just recently started one which I might as well talk to you about. So I was attempting to read The Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This was going to be for my O in Defense Against the Dark Arts, which is to read a book from an English author, but I can't, I'm sorry. Virginia Woolf is such hard work in her fiction, and this is her first fiction book that I've attempted, and I am not on board for her style. I get that it would have been revolutionary at the time. She does that very like close third person, but jumping from head to head, and we will literally jump from like person's POV to another person's POV in a sentence, and like, it's really hard work. I had the audiobook and I had no idea what was going on, so I tried reading the physical book, and it was just, my brain is not at the right point right now to be able to enjoy this. Like, I'm not there. I need like a solid day to dedicate to this, and I don't know if I actually want to. Like, I don't enjoy the kind of the subject matter, which is pretty much just like the mundane relationships between people, and I don't really like any of them, any of the characters in this book, which means that I don't really care about their relationships. So when I'm having to work really hard to even keep track of who's thinking what about who, I don't think this is for me. I've DNF'd it. I've not completely abandoned it. It's on my DNF return to list, which is distinct from my DNF abandoned list on Goodreads. So I may be inclined to try it again at some point in the future. And I do have more Virginia Woolf on my shelf that I'm like not dead against reading, but this one for me right now just wasn't working. And then I very ambitiously started a book today that I just know I'm not actually going to finish, so I might as well kind of mention it here. It does have an English setting, so if I did hypothetically finish it, it would fit for this prompt. But that's Rather Weird by Andrew Caldecott. Yeah, look at that. This is a historical fiction set in London and also in modern day London, and it's about kids with weird powers. I am not far in. Am I only 15 pages in? I'm only 15 pages in. I'm never finishing this tonight, so this is going to drift over into my September one, and in which case I'll make it fit a Monsterathon prompt, because I feel like if you're only 15 pages into a book, you're allowed to let it count for a different prompt. And then the only other ones that I didn't get to on my original TBR was 2 graphic novels, and you might be like, Emma, you could read them tonight and then pick up 2 more qualifications. But I'm just not in the graphic novel mood. Like, it's really weird. I actually tried to pick up these books literally like 6 or 7 times throughout the month. It's Chew volume 3 and volume 4, and I don't want to read. I flicked through the first few pages of volume 3, like literally, like I said, 6 or 7 times, and I'm not focusing on it. I'm not in the mood for it, and I just need to really listen to my gut on this one and be like, put them aside and come to them when you really want to read them. So I do think that sometimes readathons, especially these ones where it's a little bit more competitive and you are trying to like hit as many books as you can for kind of like external reasons to do with the rules of the readathon, it can mean that you get backed into corners where you're reading things that you're not necessarily in the mood for, which was why I was really not sure about whether I was going to DNF to the Lighthouse or not, because I was like, oh, you're over 100 pages in, like, come on, you can get this extra qualification. And it's like, they're not real. I'm not actually going to become a curse breaker, and it's extra credit anyway. So it's just kind of deciding to listen to my gut and embrace the mood reading aspect, which I've kind of been ignoring my mood reading side recently and being quite good with TBRs, which is a really weird way of thinking about a hobby that realistically nobody cares what I read. I'm not like doing it for school or anything like that. There are no ramifications if I just made a TBR and then read literally nothing from it and read a bunch of other books. So I think it was kind of trying to free myself up from the constraints of a TBR. So I'm going to be really interested to see how September goes, because I'm kind of not feeling my Monsterathon TBR right now, but I might give myself like the first few days, maybe even full week, to just kind of mood read, and hopefully some of the mood reading might fit into the prompts later down the line, and if not, then fuck it, it's fine, it's fine. So yeah, that's pretty much it for me. This was a hella long wrap up because so many books, but generally to books and some new favourites, and just yeah, generally had a good time reading. So that is it. Have you read any of these? What are your thoughts on them? And there is a haul coming fairly soon, so I'm really excited about that. Keep an eye out for that bad boy. And yeah, have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye!